Welcome to AFSPA Talks, a production of the American Foreign Service Protective Association. Each month, we deliver informative health and wellness topics you want to know about, so make sure to subscribe to us on your preferred podcast platform. And if you have any questions about content discussed in this episode, ask them at AFSPA Live, our live Q&A session streaming every last Thursday of the month at 11 a.m. Eastern Time on youtube.com/AFSPA Cares. Now here's your host, Chief Executive Officer Kyle Longton.
Welcome to another episode of AFSPA Talks. I'm Kyle Longton, and with me today,
Maddie Norton.
Maddie, as always, thank you for being here, for making the magic happen in the background as well.
Of course.
It's June, and we've got a couple themes that we're talking about this month. Men's Health Month. Just yesterday, as this episode's coming out, just yesterday was Father's Day. So we're trying to encourage, and guys, we're not usually very good about taking care of ourselves. We lag behind women in pretty much every measure of seeking and getting care. Maybe not needing it, but seeking and getting care. So get out there, use this Men's Health Month as a reminder to take care of yourself. But we're also focused, it's June, and our focus for AFSPA Talks and AFSPA Live this month is Pride Month.
Happy Pride.
Happy Pride. Happy Pride to all of our listeners who identify as members of the LGBTQ plus community and their allies and family members who are out there. There are unique needs for our members who identify as members of that community, and we're doing our best this month to take some time to acknowledge the benefits and programs that are available to meet their needs. And our focus on these benefits ties in really with our theme for the year, which is choose health because you matter. Maddie, as we've been talking about this month, I know we're both on the same page about this, that we firmly believe that everybody matters. And regardless of where they identify as a member of the LGBTQ plus community, an ally, supporter, whatever it may be. And we want to do all that we can at AFSPA, and particularly with the Foreign Service Benefit Plan, to provide access to the medically necessary care that everybody needs to achieve their best version of themselves.
Absolutely.
So, ma'am, one of you can give us a little introduction to the topic for the day, for today's episode.
Yeah, so as it is Pride Month, we're going to be discussing how parents can support their children who are exploring their identities in terms of gender identity or sexual attraction, or maybe both. We know we probably don't have children or teens listening to our podcast. If you are, shout out to you. But we thought this might be a good topic for any parents abroad or in the States. And we have a returning guest with us.
We do. We are so lucky to have back with us Alyssa Clayden, who is now Dr. Alyssa Clayden. For longtime listeners, you may recognize her name and soon her voice from an episode back in 2021 when we were just getting off the ground with this podcast. She was one of our earliest guests. And Maddie, since you were not here last time that Alyssa was on the pod, I wonder if you would take us through an introduction, a little overview of her professional bio.
I would love to. So Alyssa is a licensed clinical social worker who has provided international mental health care for more than 2 decades in a wide variety of settings. Alyssa works often with transgender and gender nonconforming folks, new and prospective parents, including infertility, folks with trauma experiences, and adolescents. Having lived, worked, and raised a family across 5 continents, Alyssa is passionate about providing high-quality intersectional mental health care to people living and working internationally. She believes that every person brings expertise, strengths, and skills to their lives and relationships. Alyssa teaches courses on equitable mental health care and has particular interest in the impact of intersectional identities on mental health. Alyssa's academic research focuses on how mental health care can be improved for folks with diverse ethnic, cultural, linguistic, racial, religious, and gender identities.
And I will just say in advance that we are grateful to Alyssa for agreeing to talk with us again. We were connected originally and once again with Alyssa through our longtime partners at the Truman Group. And they have for years been providing mental health care to expat Americans around the world, and a continually growing number of our members who work with Alyssa and other providers to the Truman Group. So thank you to Alyssa and to everybody at Truman Group for that partnership. And without further ado, here's our conversation with Alyssa. Alyssa, welcome back to AFSPA Talks.
Thanks, Kyle. It's good to be here.
Well, we chatted a few minutes ago before we started the recording. It's been 3 years since we talked last, and honestly, the time has flown, but a lot has changed. But some things have not changed, including that June is Pride Month, and
Yes.
that's part of the reason why we're talking. It's Pride Month for members of the LGBTQIA community. And I know that a lot of your work is with people, particularly youth, who identify as members of this community.
Mhm.
And I so appreciated it. I mean, our last conversation was educational for me in a number of ways, and I really appreciated that you introduced me to more inclusive terms, such as gender identity spectrum and sexual attraction spectrum. I'm just wondering if you could, for our listeners who may be new to the podcast or need a refresher, if you could talk to us sort of about what we're talking about when we're talking about members of the LGBTQIA community and the breadth of that community, that it's not just, one definition.
Sure. Yes, absolutely. So yeah, when we talk about LGBTQIA plus spaces, I think, a lot of times people, um, uh, the LGBT is maybe the most familiar, right? Lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, that kind of language is most familiar. The shift to gender identity spectrum and sexual attraction spectrum is language that really helps us to think both ourselves and in terms of the larger community, that larger queer community, to be able to think about just how broad the spectrum is that folks exist in terms of who it is that they are attracted to and who it is that they are in terms of gender identity in really vast and different ways. Definitely not a lot of similarity. And I think particularly when we're talking about young people and we're talking about a lot of the language that's changing almost every day right now in these spaces, I think it can help us as parents, as adults, as community members to also be able to think more about if we're on a large spectrum, asking people when they come to us and say like, oh, I have a different gender identity than just on that binary, that male female binary, to be able to say like, oh, okay, where on that spectrum do you fall and how would you describe that? So it helps us individualize those identities, I think, a little bit more effectively.
And absolutely, and I appreciate that because I think I've had conversations with my own parents where they're trying to understand some of the terms that they've heard or changes in pronouns and things like that. And so it is changing, it's evolving, and I will also invite you, if for some reason I use a term during our conversation that is outdated, to please redirect us in the conversation. And I'm just wondering, is there a typical age when children sort of start exploring their identities, whether it's gender identity or sexual attraction, and what does that look like? What might parents or other family members see?
So we see a really broad spectrum of what that looks like. So it can start at really young ages. You might see kids who are visibly presenting differently, ages 2, 3, 4, 5, who are expressing different language, who are disputing the language that parents or adults around them are using. Or we might not see it until quite a bit later. There are a lot of like teens and preteens who will start to explore that identity as they enter into like late primary school, middle school, sometimes into high school, where we'll start to see them asking to change pronouns, asking to change names, things like that. And sometimes we don't see it openly show up until they're at university. And one of the things that I think is important is parents often will express to me that they're concerned that if it's not happening at that really young age, then it's not really what they're going through. It's not really what the issue is, or the concern that it's something else, that it's too much influence from social media. We hear that a lot. Or that it's something that like they're just experimenting, it's a phase, it'll pass. And so being able to, as parents, recognize that young people have a lot of different reasons for why they may or may not disclose, or they have a lot of different, every child, every person develops differently. They may need more time to get into that conversation. They may not be thinking about some of those pieces at as early of age as others are. I know we see this a lot around sexual attraction spectrum, where you can have kiddos who, at ages 7, 8, 9 are talking about boyfriends, girlfriends, holding hands. And you can have kids who are, 13, 14, 15 who are like, I'm not interested. I'm not, right. And so even like around those conversations, sometimes they're not even exploring those identities until later teen years or even into their 20s.
So, and I appreciate just sort of the broad overview that you gave, because I have heard people my own life saying, "Oh, well, this must just be a fad. They're just trying something out, or this is the influence of that new friend or that new friend group or something." And
Yes.
and that's not the case. We can meet people where they are, even if that who they are is changing a little bit, at least from our perception.
Yeah.
And so I guess I'm asking for the parents, assuming parents are listening. I don't know that we have a lot of children and teens who tune in for the podcast, but for parents and other family members and allies, like, how can parents provide like an open space for children to explore, and then also to talk about it?
Hmm. One of the things that I think is most helpful from a parental perspective or an ally perspective is to not worry about whether or not you understand it. I think a lot of times what happens with adults in particular is, as soon as we hear that, even if we want to be supportive, as soon as we hear, oh, I'm changing my pronouns, or I'm changing my name, or I think I'm a lesbian, I think I'm pansexual, I think I'm non-binary, there's a tendency as adults to be like, okay, what does that mean? What am I supposed to do? What does that look like? And we tend to like lock in on whatever perception we first develop early on. And that can be really difficult for the young person, because it means that we're then not actually meeting them where they are. And so if we can think less about, I don't understand, right? So if parents say to me, like, I don't understand what this identity is, I want to, the most supportive parents struggle with the idea that, I think there's a myth that you have like parents who are just like supportive and they're great at it and everything goes well, or you're not supportive. But that's the vast majority of parents that I work with. They love their children. They want to make their lives work for them. They want them to be safe and healthy and happy. And so they're trying to navigate the space where they want to say the right things and they want to know exactly what they need to do. And what I ask of parents, like when I'm doing therapy with them or
Yeah.
family sessions, is I ask them to stop trying to understand it and to instead let their child provide what they have access to not worry about what the child doesn't have access to. So like an example of that is, if I'm working with a 10-year-old who is thinking that they might be somewhere along that gender identity spectrum, and they're exploring, maybe I'm non-binary, maybe I'm a trans male, I'm not sure. What I'll talk to parents about is, if that's the language they're giving you, great, use that language. If they haven't given you any other language, try not to add other language. Try not to say, like, what do you mean by non-binary? Does that mean this? Does that mean that? Does that mean, right? Try to just give them that room for their own exploration. There's often an urgency in parents, and I think part of it's anxiety based. I think really genuinely they want to be supportive. They want their kid to know that they're supportive, and they're worried about what their kid's experience will be if they're in that identity. So they just like want to be ready, right? They want to have it in place. So sometimes there's a lot of urgency around, well, either you're this or you're not, like,
Right.
or
We need to know exactly what we're dealing with in their perception.
exactly. Yes. And so just a reminder to parents, like, it's okay. It's okay. If you think about it, I like really concrete examples, like, you put your kid in basketball and you hope that they like it, and they come out of a season and they're like, that was dumb, I'm not doing that again, right? Like, let them explore. We let them explore all these other things. It's okay to let them explore these components of identity. It's okay to to hear them when they say that this is what they think is working. It's okay to hear them when they say, I don't think that was quite right. I think I want to use another term, another name. I think I'm thinking about something different. It doesn't change who they are. It just lets them move through that process really in a really genuine way, that what we see on the other end in terms of mental health means that they are, better adjusted. They know themselves better. They can take care of themselves. They have better resiliency and certainty in self.
And we're talking about children and youth, but I appreciate you touched on, and I wonder if there's more that we should explore on this, about sort of like what parents may be going through. They may be feeling anxiety about getting this right and making sure that they can provide a safe space for their kids. But I'm wondering if in your practice, you said decades now, like as you've done the family therapy, maybe you worked with parents who are trying to support a child who's exploring and changing their identity, perhaps, like, or at least a change from the parents' expectation of that identity, may be the best way to put it. What might the parent be going through on their own, even if they're showing support to the child? What might they be feeling on their own?
Yes, it's, I think a lot of times parents get kind of glossed over in this space, because for many of us nowadays, there is a goal to support kiddos who are, across that sexual attraction, gender identity, those spectrums, right? And so sometimes it's really easy to almost like demonize parents if they're struggling, right? To feel like they're not trying hard enough, or to feel like, I know as clinicians, one of the things that we talk about is, if we have a first session with parents and there's a lot of language that we know would be harmful to that young person, sometimes we have to check ourselves and recognize that this is where this person's starting, and it's where they should be starting, because for them in that moment, that's where they are, right? We want to trust that that's their experience. What I have seen over the years is that parents experience an enormous amount of grief. Not every parent, but the vast majority of them, whether intentional or not, when we as humans become parents, there often is a sense of what that means, what it means to be a parent, what the possibilities are for your children. There are lots of examples, I think, culturally around, people who want their kids to have a certain career, right? Or they want them to, to play a certain kind of sport. Like, these are places that parents do put a lot of investment into. And I think that we recognize parents put a lot of investment into. I think it's more subconscious that we sometimes put investment into our child's gender, or into what our child's future family might look like. So, I've worked with parents who, their 12-year-old comes out as gay, and the parent is like, I know that gay couples have kids, but
Yeah.
I don't know what that will look like. So they're already grieving their grandchildren,
Mhm.
right? So they're way ahead of where that child is, but that's where that parent's head is. And it's really important to work with them in that space, to accept that that's where their head has gone, and to help them process that grief. There also can be things like, some parents, I've worked with families who have maybe like 3, 4, 5 kiddos, and it's because they really wanted a little girl, or they really wanted a little boy, and they got one kiddo in that category of gender that they were looking for, and then that kiddo is trans.
Mhm.
And then they feel like they've lost something that they were so desperately wanting, right? And so helping them process what it is that's coming up for them, allowing for that grief, but allowing for it in a therapeutic space, right? What we don't want is for parents to feel like that's information they give their kid, right? We don't want the child to carry that grief, but we definitely want to offer space for parents to be able to grieve and to process, and to be able to figure out, okay, where do I go next? How do I move past this assumption that I made, these needs of my own that my child was carrying, and move into a space where I can see my child as they are, and I can meet them where they are.
That's profound, I think. And a tall order for a lot of parents, but I think it's not going to happen, as you indicated, overnight.
Hmm.
And it's not something we necessarily we want to gloss over for parents. I'm just curious, and have you seen shifts in sort of how parents approach these explorations of identity in their children over the years? Has there been generational shifts or anything like that? And again, not to demonize earlier generations or anything like that. I'm just curious. You said earlier that the focus now seems to be on supporting kids, and just wondering if that has sort of been a shift over time.
Yeah, definitely. I definitely have seen changes, larger numbers of parents who are coming into, particularly around gender identity in most recent years. But, even, I would say the last 15 to 20 years, the way that sexual attraction is talked about and discussed, um, definitely seeing less stigmatization and less shame on parent sides, and more willingness to kind of have conversations and figure things out, even if it is difficult, even if it is fraught. I do not want to diminish the fact that there are still LGBTQIA plus young people who are not able to lean on their families, who are not able to stay safely at home, right? There definitely are still struggles in that space. But the numbers of parents who are willing to come in and have conversations, even if they don't understand, even if they are afraid, even if they hurt because there is loss for them, I would say has increased exponentially. And one of the things I find most interesting around gender identity spectrum is that, we are all literally living in that change right now. Like, we are part of history right now. And younger generations, I would say millennials, kind of like leak into this, but it's really been Gen Z and these younger ages who have been very adamant about, we need language for this. We need to talk about this. And the internet certainly helps spread some of that information around. And so we, part of this entire process is being able to recognize that this is a moving, changing social space and shape. And I think as people become more comfortable with the language, which we are seeing in general, more aware of these concepts, that people are better able to, to different degrees, be accepting or tolerant of some of these changes, even if they don't necessarily match with their own perceptions or conceptions of gender or sexual attraction.
I'll
Well,
say, sorry, Kyle.
please.
I'll just say, I was listening to a podcast this morning actually about the different generations and how, especially like Gen X and even some of the millennials, when difficult topics came up, or, even like tragedy happened in families, it was very common to just not talk about it. And it would just be like, oh, this did happen in our family, but we're not going to address it. And I've also seen conversations where it's like, well, I haven't met anybody, or I don't know anybody on the like LGBTQI, like a spectrum, or, I don't know anybody like that. And it's like, this just popped up. Like, this is just like a boom of like, people like this. And it's like, well, it just wasn't talked about. It's just like you were in a space where that just may not have been a comfortable conversation in your family or in your town or wherever. And I think that a lot of generations and parents especially have gotten to get used to that, or like are trying to. And I definitely think like the older generations, as we move forward, are seeing like, oh, I actually did know people like that, and it was just something that wasn't discussed. And so I think like what you were saying was just like having that open conversation, and it's okay to ask those questions. It's okay to Google. It's okay to, find resources and things like that, just because it may not be something that you're familiar with. And that's why when, your child or whoever does come out, or, wants to have that conversation, it can feel like your world's, tilted on its like axis, when it's just like you had this perceived conception of who you thought your child was, and now you're grieving the loss of what, you had planned in the future for your child or whatever. And it's like, that's understandable, and it's okay to process that and, grieve it, but also support your child in the same way.
Yeah, that's Maddie. I love that connection to like what communication has looked like in the past, because I also think I want to, be really thoughtful. I think baby boomers and Gen X also get a pretty bad rap around like, oh, they're so intolerant, and oh, what's wrong with
Are
them,
there
right?
some of them here?
And
No.
No.
and what I think is really important is that a lot of it really does come down to like, like we just didn't talk about it. And I have found in a lot of conversations that the sexual attraction spectrum piece, that's kind of like 20 years ahead of the gender identity spectrum piece, right? And so a lot of times, particularly in Gen X, if I have parents who are like, but I don't understand, I can be like, okay, what was it like when you first started hearing stories about people being gay,
Mhm.
about same-sex couples, and so they can be like, oh, and
Yeah.
so it doesn't always translate directly, but that's an experience that they themselves went through, which has been really helpful.
Mhm.
I also have had really interesting conversations with like teens or college students who will say, I told my parents, I had to tell my grandparents, so they've got grandparents like sometimes right at the very beginning of that
Yeah.
boomer stage, and they're like, I was really afraid. And my grandma was like, oh yeah, I used to work with blah, blah, blah.
Right.
And they'll be like, my
Yeah.
grandma is more accepting than my parents.
Mhm.
Like my parents are still like, are you
Yeah.
sure? Because the parents are dealing with their own misconceptions, or they're dealing with
Right.
their anxieties, like, will my kid be safe? Or so
Mhm.
it's kind of interesting. I mean, we do see definitely a mix, but a lot of times what I hear from young people who are coming out is that they expected resistance because it's not been talked about at home,
Right.
but because they started communicating, the rest of the family then started communicating
Mhm.
back, and there's less intolerance than they expected.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
And I think especially with like media today, like obviously we have the internet, but you're seeing more and more on like shows that are on the 8 o'clock hour,
Right.
on like ABC, CBS, shows where kids and even people are exploring their identities to where it's like, you might be watching the news and then the next sitcom comes on and it's like you're being met with like this new idea, and it's something that can create conversations like that. So I do think um, people are having conversations just with like the media and everything like that. So I definitely agree with you. You might be surprised how tolerant some people are.
I think that the representation in sitcoms, in literature,
Yeah.
and particularly sort of young adult YA literature and so forth, like much broader than it used to be. And Alyssa, I really appreciate what you said, sort of like thinking back 25 years to like, what did this look like when we were talking about changes in understanding of sexual attraction? And we're sort of in that same place now with gender identity.
All right. And I'd love to know, are there any common misconceptions or myths about sexual identity and attraction that parents and even allies should be aware of when they're talking with their children? Just because I know being from the South and things like that, I've heard some strange things. And it can be kind of hard to combat that. And I'd love to hear if there are ways to go about that.
Yeah, it's such a big question, right? I think there are a lot of different ways that people kind of come to these conversations. One of the biggest ones around kids just as a whole is I'm surprised at how many parents and adults really lean into an assumption that social media and the internet are the only reason that any
Yeah.
of this exists. And kind of the fears around, does that mean we should cut off access? Will they go back to who they were if we cut off access? Right, a lot of things like that sexual attraction and gender identity are socially influenced. And so being able to help people understand that these are components of who people are, and that it's not about, it's not like all of my friends wear berets,
Yeah.
and so I'm going to wear a beret, right? I hope
Yeah.
there are groups of kids like that everywhere.
Mhm.
But instead that sometimes when we get exposure to things, when we have information that we didn't have before, it helps us to really think a lot more about ourselves. Working with folks who are living overseas, an example that I will often give is, you come out of your home country and you go to another country and you have these assumptions about like what appropriate behavior is. And then you're living in this other country and culture and you're seeing behaviors that like back in the US, if that's your country of origin, would not be acceptable, would not be an option. And yet that's what everybody does, and nobody's upset except me, the foreigner who's in this space, right? And so I think a lot of times being able to think more about when we are exposed to something, only then do we know what our biases and assumptions are. And that there's also room to reinvestigate who we are and ways that we could operate differently. Maybe I think a lot of folks who work overseas will actually adopt things from the cultures that they've lived in, that they're like, gosh, I really like that piece. I really think that that is a useful way to think about my home, my community, my family, myself, and they'll integrate that into their identities, not because they are giving up a piece of themselves or it's peer pressure or anything like that, but because that's something that's part of who they are, but they never really knew that that was an option. And so it's a little bit similar when you're talking sexual attraction, gender identity. If we don't have the language, how are we supposed to communicate that? And so one of the great things about that access online is that it does help people look. But what it also means is there's a lot of information out there, and there's a lot, like I said, we're history building as we go. And so it means that young people also, they might chop and change quite a bit because they're trying to figure out what makes sense for them, as we all do, right? We all go through those phases when we are in our teenage years, even as adults. There are a lot of folks who are transitioning as adults now, where we have to try to figure out who we are, how we want to identify, like what best defines who we are in our identity. And so I think there's also a myth that like if your kid comes out and says, I'm a lesbian, or your kid comes out and says, I'm a trans female, that's who they are. And so even the most accepting parents will be like, great, okay, that's your identity. And then maybe in a couple of years, the kid says, that's not quite right. I think what I am is this, or I think the language that best fits is that. We see a lot with gender identity. We see a general pattern where first people come out as on the sexual attraction spectrum.
Yeah.
So they first will express a difference in sexual attraction other than heterosexual. And then a couple years later, they'll express, that's not quite right. Actually, I think this is more of a gender identity issue and identity building component than it is sexual attraction. And parents often really struggle with that. They'll say, no, they're not. That's not what your identity is. It's because you identify as a lesbian, that you think you're trans masked, that you, so that's not a requirement. So really helping, I think in terms of the mythology, helping adults recognize that this is a process. We can't expect we don't expect that of ourselves in a lot of ways, that we would just know that this is exactly who we are and who we want to be, especially at age 10 or at age 15. But allowing room for that process, and that if just because a kid picks one thing, one language piece, and then changes it, doesn't mean that it's inauthentic or doesn't mean that they've changed their mind. The only other one that really comes to mind for me, there are lots of myths and misconceptions, I think, just, in general, but they are in small pockets. But these are ones I see really consistently. And one of the other ones is sometimes trans youth, they will go through like presentation transition, and maybe they're looking at starting hormones, and they might express to their parents, sometimes I wish I hadn't sometimes I wish I wasn't trans, they'll say. Sometimes I wish I hadn't ever made the change. And parents will say, oh, you're not trans. Oh, we need to transition back. Oh, you need to change your presentation. And when I talk with kids who are using that language, and a lot of kids do, especially in recent years, as like conversations about gender identity have become so public, in a way that I certainly have never seen before. They will say, I'm not expressing that I'm not trans or that I'm not happy with who I am or that I don't want to continue forward. I'm expressing that this is hard.
Yes. Yeah.
And for parents to be able to hear that and understand that it's okay for them to express that, and also trust them that they are moving in the direction they want to go in, I think is important.
Okay. Well, and it brings me to a question I want to have, which I don't want to delve into the political, and so we'll stay on this side of that. But it's only been 3 years since we last spoke, but a lot has changed. In particular, there have been a lot of changes at the state levels, and even in some cases nationally, when it comes to court decisions about the ability of doctors to offer care to youth, and in some cases even adults who are seeking gender affirming care, which has been deemed medically necessary, and even cases where teachers or coaches or whoever else in a public setting may be barred from identifying somebody by the gender that they identify as. They must identify them as the gender assigned at birth and so forth. And
Mhm.
you know, we're not going to solve those problems here today. And I don't think they're going to go away anytime soon. When it comes to just being able to provide, making sure people have that continual access to care that is deemed medically necessary. And so what they do typically have access to is care that you provide. Even in situations where the physical prescription side may stop,
Mhm.
they still need support, and maybe even more in a different form of support when that goes away, or public statements that may accompany those changes
Mhm.
come to light that can be damaging to people who identify along these spectrums. And I'm just wondering, you know, do you have any recommendations for how parents or other allies can address the misinformation that may come about in those statements, or even the loss of care that can come about?
Yeah, I think one of the most important things, although this is also my bias because I do mental health work, is to make sure that young people who are affected by those changes have access to mental health clinicians who can have conversations with them and offer them space. Um, where they can process a lot of that out. There might be things that are outside of their control and there's nothing they can do, right? Whether they have to be taken off of medical interventions like hormones or puberty blockers, depending on where they live, or um, if it's the way that they feel about some of the things that they're reading or that people are saying, right? There are lots of ways that mental health is impacted. And because this is a component of identity, it's not, they can't just make a change, right? They can't just adjust how they operate in the world or what they need. It remains an ongoing need. It remains who they are. And so having them get access to mental health care so that they have someone they can talk to no matter what, and they don't have to feel like they have to be cautious about how they talk. That's really, really important, just upfront. I do think, for parents, sometimes parents um, struggle with kind of the balance between maybe they want to say to their kids, like, oh, we can find other options, we can do other things, we can go other places. There definitely are households that are moving states or who are getting their kids to other locations to get access to care, to try to help with
Yeah,
that, and that's great if that makes sense for the family. But it isn't always an option. And sometimes for parents sometimes have expressed to me um, that like if something like hormones for kids under 18 have been removed from an option, that
right.
sometimes they feel some relief about that because they themselves, they want to support their kiddo, but they also feel kind of anxious about what hormones might do, right? So they might be struggling themselves with kind of what is the best option. So they feel like that's been taken out of their hands. So they sometimes feel a little bit better about that. And so helping parents to recognize what parts of this process are good for them to talk to kids about and what parts aren't. So an example I can think of is, sometimes I work with a number of families where the parents have expressed outrage. They're very upset about these policies and
Sure.
they don't think it's okay and they want it to be different, but they're expressing that a lot to their kid and they feel like that's supportive of their young person. See, I'm angry. See, I support you. So this is bad. But what the young person hears instead, a lot of the time, what they'll talk to me about is, I feel like I have to take care of my parent. Why is my parent so like it's me?
Yeah.
So it's really interesting as the parent is trying to be supportive. Sometimes they get lost a little bit in like that macro piece and have a harder time kind of seeing where their kiddo is. Um, One of the other ones then is sometimes parents will disclose like, well, I'm glad we don't have to make the decision, now that you can't get access to hormones, we don't
Oh,
have to worry
sure.
about if it would have been negative. And that also can make kids feel really negative. Sometimes parents haven't disclosed their uncertainty before, and it comes out in this space, and parents think it sounds very supportive, and it kind of helps the child have less distress over policy changes. But then often what I hear from kiddos is, I thought they were on board, and now
Yeah.
it sounds like they weren't, and what does
Was
that mean? And And so that can be really quickly confused, and it can really quickly become a difficult dynamic. So for parents, kind of helping them, also think about asking more questions of the child. How are you feeling about this? I notice this has been coming up in my feeds. Is it coming up in yours? Do you have any questions? What can I do to support you? Rather than kind of like stepping in and trying to fix whatever they feel like is going on by projecting ourselves as the adult into it. That question and letting the kiddo lead, I think, is a really big part of managing, changing social and cultural dynamics.
Well, and that's in the US. And there's challenges here and there, and as you said, sometimes we can access mental health across either within the state or across state lines in some cases, or even access the physical care and prescription drugs and so forth across state lines if need be. But like,
Mhm.
you deal with a lot of our members who are overseas. And in some cases, in some locations, it's literally not safe, to the point of being illegal and beyond,
Mhm.
a capital crime in some places, to identify anywhere other than at the what has been deemed the proper end of a spectrum, whether it be sexual attraction or gender identity, and to express anything other than that can be dangerous.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious, like, do you have specific advice for youth and families when they're going to posts and living outside the US?
Yes. So this is such a complicated part of, any kind of foreign service work, right? Because um uh you have kiddos who are in international schools that often are talking about maybe more Western or more US centric values, but are within a national context where those values might be different, or certainly some of those laws might be different. And I think for parents, one of the main things is, as you're bidding for positions, as you're looking for places that you want to be, doing some research on, what the laws are, what that looks like. What young people often describe is that in countries where there's no like explicit law, like um, it's maybe not standard or typical to see folks who are on the gender identity or sexual attraction spectrums in public spaces, but it's not specifically legislated as a crime, that there's more overall tolerance kind of across the board. It's not even something that's necessarily talked about. And so that gives them some freedom. There's more safety there. Things can be a little more accepting or tolerant. And in nations where there are very clear, direct, legal problems with having those identities, that those feel less safe simply because even talking about it sometimes can be difficult. We have seen in just the last couple of years, in certain nations, on certain continents, there's been, not dissimilar to the US, there's been a move to restrict a lot of sexual attraction and gender identity, everything. Culture maybe is the best way
Yeah.
to say it. And so even like paying attention to changing dynamics, and recognizing if you're in one of those nations when that changes. I know that there are, for example, international schools who have had to change their own policies. They've had to remove like queer friendly signs on the walls and things like that. Being able to talk openly with your kiddo about that, and being able to talk to them about what they're feeling. Where do they feel safe? Where do they not feel safe? Some kids will say, look, it doesn't affect me on a day-to-day basis, so I'm not really concerned, right? They might be, we use the word stealth in gender identity, like they might be their gender identity. People know them as that gender identity, rather than what they were assigned at birth. And they're okay with how things play out. That's just how it is, and they're okay to kind of stay in that space. Other kiddos might talk about, I don't want to do as much in these spaces, or I need to change how I communicate, or my friend group is going to maybe be a little more isolationist because there are these kind of other threads of conversation happening. I also think international schools are generally dealing with this also in real time. And so parents, I strongly recommend that they talk to school administrators, school teachers, school counselors, and say, what does this look like on our kiddos' end? What are your recommendations? What are you doing as a school that can be inclusive? What do you have to change as a school that's maybe less inclusive? And then that way everybody's on the same page. That often is very helpful, because young people will often express to me that if their parents are talking about it and their school is talking about it, even if there are greater restrictions, even if the country itself is not necessarily open to who they are, they feel okay because they know they have this support system in place.
Okay. And I think that's a great way to approach it, and especially leaning on the educational resources that are there. And I'll also just add that for foreign service families who have concerns about access or adequacy of treatment options overseas, particularly for gender affirming care, please contact the Bureau of Medical Services or the local health unit to get guidance on what is available. That is a great resource before you're making the decisions. Alyssa, this has been great. And I'm just wondering, before we wrap up, is there anything you'd like to add? Anything that you feel like we've missed in the conversation today?
I think the only other piece that I would add is I hear from a lot of parents, even though there's a lot of conversation about, particularly again, gender identity at the moment. But for parents who have kiddos who are coming out in these spaces and who are having these conversations, a lot of them talk about feeling alone, and about feeling ill-equipped. And so I always recommend that folks remember that there are communities all over the globe who are going through these experiences, to not feel like it's something you have to carry by yourself, to seek support, to find other families. I know just from the work that I do with Truman Group, we know there are multiple families in probably every international school out there who are going through this, even if they're not disclosing it. Try to be as open as you can to bringing other people into the conversation, because you don't have to do it on your own. And using, like you were talking about earlier, using the representation that is there now to help educate yourself, to help feel more comfortable in these spaces, to trust yourself more maybe than I think a lot of parents do, to be able to, step in. Parenting is a lot of, you step into spaces and you have no idea what you're doing, and you figure it out because you're focused on your kiddo and you're focused on doing right by them. So you do that in all these other realms. You can definitely do that in these identity spaces. It's okay to not know. It's okay to make mistakes. It's okay to have your kid get frustrated with you or irritated with you because you're struggling. But being open to more exposure, more questions, and more community, I think really helps this process to go better for everybody.
And Alyssa, thank you for helping us speak to that community, for being part of that community, for so many of our members who turn to you for support, not just through this podcast, but also for one-on-one and group support. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Kyle.
Thanks again to Dr. Alyssa Clayden for joining us for today's episode. If you're searching for resources to support you or a family member, please check our website at afspa.org for the coverage and programs that we provide in terms of gender affirming care as well as mental health support. We will also include in today's show notes a list of other resources that may be helpful to those who are looking for community, as Alyssa discussed, and other support. This has been AFSPA Talks, a production of the American Foreign Service Protective Association. All information offered in this podcast is meant to be educational. The views expressed by the hosts and guests are their own and do not necessarily represent AFSPA. Should there be any discrepancy between information offered in this podcast and official plan documents for the Foreign Service Benefit Plan or the other products offered by AFSPA, the policy provisions will prevail. Thanks for listening, and be sure to subscribe to AFSPA Talks to catch our next episode. Please rate and review us on your favorite podcast app and share feedback with us on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and on YouTube, where you can find videos of these episodes. We'll talk again soon.
Thanks for listening to this episode of AFSPA Talks. Be sure to subscribe to our channel so you'll never miss an episode. If you have any follow-up questions about the topics in this episode, Join our AFSPA Live Q&A session on the last Thursday of every month. We will be streaming live at 11 a.m. Eastern Time on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/AFSPA Cares. Thanks for listening.